The road stretches out like an endless ribbon, a long, unbroken line that seems to disappear into the emptiness of the desert night. The headlights of the car slice through the thick, inky blackness, casting a pale glow on the rough asphalt that seems to tremble under the weight of the world's silence. It's a road that, to the untrained eye, might seem like just another stretch of highway, lonely, desolate, and barren, yet nothing out of the ordinary. But for those who know its secrets, this is a road that holds something darker, something far more unsettling than what the eye can see. Eric and Jane were two people who knew nothing about the road's haunted history, nor did they expect it to play such a pivotal role in their lives, or in their disappearance. They were simply driving down it, like so many others before them, on their way to a weekend getaway in the desert. For them, it was supposed to be a break from the monotony of everyday life, a few days spent under the vast, starry sky, free from the constraints of their busy routines. But little did they know, the road had other plans for them. It was as if the desert itself had been waiting for them, a silent and unseen force that would soon claim them, as it had claimed so many before. At first glance, the desert is beautiful. The stillness, the tranquility, the quiet hum of life that moves in the subtle rhythms of the wind and the sand. But this very beauty is what conceals the darkness beneath the surface. As the car rolls on, the air thick with the scent of dust and the echo of distant coyotes, there's something almost oppressive about the emptiness, the kind of emptiness that seems to stretch out forever, a vast, infinite space where time slows down and even the stars feel too far away to touch. In that space, everything feels both alien and ancient, as though the land itself carries the weight of countless untold stories, stories that are never meant to be revealed. Eric and Jane had been driving for hours when they first noticed the oddness of the road. It wasn't a drastic change, but there was something subtly off. The way the air felt heavier, as if it were pressing in on them, the quiet that enveloped them, so thick it almost felt suffocating. Even the headlights of their car, which had once cut through the dark with sharp clarity, now seemed to fade into the void. The road had become like a trap, pulling them deeper into its jaws. But it wasn't until later that they would understand just how deeply the desert could entangle them. A soft hum from the dashboard punctuates the silence, the only sound in the car. Eric's eyes flicker toward the rear-view mirror, and for a moment, he thinks he sees something moving in the distance, something just beyond the edge of the headlights. But when he looks again, there's nothing there. He tries to shake off the unsettling feeling that creeps over him, but the desert air feels too still, too quiet. He glances over at Jane, who is staring out the passenger window, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the dashboard lights. She doesn't seem to notice anything strange. She seems calm, peaceful even, enjoying the ride. It's then that he remembers why they were out here in the first place. The weekend getaway, the time to themselves, away from the demands of their work and the distractions of the city. It was supposed to be an escape, a chance to recharge. But as the minutes stretch on, the quiet of the desert seems to seep into their bones, making everything feel heavier, more ominous. For a moment, Eric wonders if the road is getting longer. He checks the clock and then his phone, but the time doesn't seem to match the distance they've traveled. They've been driving for over an hour, but it feels as though they've only just left the city. It's a strange sensation and one that sends a shiver down his spine. There's no obvious reason for it, no visible landmarks that could indicate a change in time or space. Yet, the longer they stay on the road, the more disoriented they begin to feel. As Jane begins to doze off, her head resting against the window, Eric shakes off the unease that's slowly crawling up his back. He turns the volume up on the radio, but the static seems to drown out any music that might come through. He adjusts the dial, hoping for something to break the silence, but all he hears is a low hum, like the sound of distant thunder, or perhaps the pulse of the earth itself. For a brief moment, it feels as though the radio is trying to tell him something, a message buried beneath the static, but he quickly dismisses the thought. It's just the desert playing tricks on his mind. And then, just as suddenly as the disquiet began, the road shifts again. There's a slight bend ahead, barely noticeable, but it pulls him in like a magnet. The headlights flicker momentarily as they round the curve, and for a fraction of a second, Eric feels a sharp jolt in his chest. Something is different. Something is wrong. The faint outline of a sign in the distance catches his eye, but it's too far off to make out. He tries to focus on it, but the road continues to stretch out ahead, empty, featureless. The seconds seem to stretch into eternity as they press on, the weight of the desert closing in around them. There's no escape, no end to the road, only the endless silence. At times, it's as if the desert itself is alive, watching them from the shadows, pulling them deeper into its fold with every mile. But what really unnerves Eric is the feeling that they're not alone. It's subtle at first, just the tiniest flicker in the rearview mirror, the faintest sound in the distance. But as they drive further, the sensation intensifies. He checks the mirror again, but this time, the faint glow of another set of headlights is visible in the distance. It's far off, but it's there, following them at a steady pace. The car doesn't pass them, doesn't speed up or slow down, just stays in the distance, trailing behind them like an invisible predator. Eric tries to reassure himself that it's just another traveler, someone on the same road, heading in the same direction. But there's something about the way the headlights move, the way they remain behind them, that doesn't sit right. It's almost as if the other car is waiting for them to make a move. He turns to Jane, but she's still asleep, unaware of the presence that's slowly closing behind them. Her peaceful expression stands in stark contrast to the growing anxiety in Eric's chest. His hand tightens around the steering wheel as he fights the urge to look in the rearview mirror again, knowing that whatever is behind them might not be something he wants to see. He pushes the thought aside, focusing instead on the road ahead. But no matter how hard he tries to ignore it, the sensation of being followed continues to gnaw at him, relentless and insistent. The headlights in the distance grow faint, then blur, then disappear altogether. But just as quickly, another set of lights appears, closer this time, and just as persistent. It's then that the quiet begins to crack. The hum from the radio changes tone, a low, distorted sound that seems to vibrate the car. It's no longer the soft static of before, but something else entirely. A voice, faint but clear, cutting through the hum. It's unintelligible at first, just a string of incoherent words. But as they drive on, the voice seems to become louder, more distinct, almost as if it's speaking directly to them. Eric's heart races. Is he hearing things? Or is something speaking to them from the dark? The voice echoes in his ears, and for a split second, he wonders if Jane heard it too. But before he can ask, the voice fades away, leaving only the oppressive silence once again. He glances in the rearview mirror, but this time, there are no headlights behind them. The road is empty. The car that had been following them is gone. But the unease remains, lingering in the air like a thick fog. The desert road, once just a quiet path through the wilderness, has now become something else. Something that watches. Something that waits. Something that refuses to let go. The headlights continue to cut through the dark, but now they seem to fade with every passing moment, swallowed by the void ahead. Eric presses on, feeling the weight of the silence growing heavier with every mile. The desert road is no longer just a place. It is an entity, a presence that will not be ignored. And in the vastness of the night, they are but tiny figures, alone and vulnerable, at the mercy of whatever waits in the shadows. As Eric and Jane drove further into the night, the vast emptiness of the desert began to settle in. It wasn't just the isolation that weighed on them, but the sensation that they were being pulled deeper into something they didn't fully understand. The road, now a long stretch of darkened asphalt, seemed endless, and the air grew colder, the kind of chill that didn't quite feel natural in the heat of the desert. They'd been driving for hours when the first signs of strange began to appear, not in the immediate landscape or in the landscape around them, but in the sensation that something was wrong. At first, they dismissed it as a momentary lapse, an echo of the long journey they'd already undertaken. But in hindsight, it became clear that something was already amiss. Eric's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced down at it, momentarily distracted from the road. It was a message from Jane's sister, Sarah, asking if they had arrived at the cabin yet. The timing felt strange, though. It was a little past 9 p.m. They were supposed to have been there by now, but the road seemed to stretch out longer than they had expected. Eric quickly typed a response. Almost there, just a few more miles. He hit send, then returned the phone to his pocket, the message feeling like a lie, though it wasn't intentional. He turned to Jane, who was curled up in the passenger seat, gazing out the window, lost in the passing scenery. The soft glow of the dashboard lights illuminated her face, but her expression was distant, as though her mind was elsewhere. It wasn't long before they both felt the shift. Something in the air changed. The quiet became heavier, almost oppressive. They had expected to be on a straight stretch of road for a while, but instead, the darkened horizon ahead seemed to curve in strange, unpredictable ways. At first, Eric thought it was his imagination, a product of the isolation pressing in on them. But as the minutes ticked by, it became undeniable. The road was stretching out unnaturally, every bend leading them further into the unknown. There were no landmarks, no signposts, no familiar reference points that could anchor them. The only thing that remained constant was the hum of the engine, the rhythmic thrum of tires on the asphalt, and the steady pulse of the headlights, which seemed to grow dimmer with every passing mile. Despite Jane's quiet demeanor, she had noticed a change too. She wasn't the kind of person who would easily admit being afraid. But the fact that she had grown unusually quiet made Eric uneasy. He stole a glance at her and saw the way her fingers clenched the fabric of her jacket, her brow furrowed. She had begun to sense it as well. "Do you feel that?" she asked softly, her voice breaking the silence between them. Eric nodded, his stomach tightening. "Yeah, I don't know. Something feels off." His eyes flicked back to the road ahead, the headlights casting long, eerie shadows that danced along the cracked asphalt. The landscape was still and unchanging, like the desert itself had frozen in time, unwilling to move or breathe. Jane's gaze drifted back to the window, her eyes tracing the barren desert beyond. It was as if the emptiness outside the car was beginning to seep inside, a tangible presence pressing on them. For a moment, Eric thought he saw something, just a flicker in the distance, a shadow moving along the edge of the road. But when he looked again, there was nothing there. His pulse quickened. Was it his imagination? Had the isolation of the desert begun to play tricks on him? "Maybe we're just tired," Jane suggested, her voice distant, like she was trying to rationalize a feeling. But Eric couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. He'd been on roads like this before, roads that seemed to go on forever, but none of them had ever felt quite like this. There was something fundamentally unsettling about the way this one stretched out before them, like it was deliberately taking them further away from where they needed to be. The longer they drove, the worse it became. The road appeared to bend in ways that didn't make sense, with curves that seemed to defy any logic. They had passed by the same piece of landscape twice now, and Eric's mind was starting to race. "This doesn't add up," he muttered under his breath, his hand tightening on the steering wheel. The headlights flickered once more, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to claw at the edges of the night. Jane didn't respond at first. She was too deep in thought, her eyes glued to the distance, where the faint outline of a distant sign glimmered weakly in the dark. She squinted, trying to make it out. "Is that a sign?" she asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. Eric looked ahead, trying to focus on the blurry shape in the distance. There was something strange about it. It didn't look like the typical road signs he was used to. No reflector panels, no bold lettering. It was barely visible against the darkness, but it felt like it was pulling them in. He slowed the car slightly, his gaze fixed on the sign as they approached. As they drew closer, the sign came into clearer view. It was old, weathered, its edges rusted and faded. The words on it were barely legible, but Eric could make out a few. "Dead end." He felt a chill crawl down his spine. Dead end? That couldn't be right. They had been driving for hours on a main highway, a road that had always been marked for travelers. There was no reason for a dead-end sign to appear here. This wasn't just a detour or a shortcut. It was something else entirely. "This isn't right," Eric said, his voice tense. He looked at Jane, who was still staring out the window, but she didn't seem as surprised as he thought she would be. Instead, she seemed oddly calm. "Do you see that sign?" he asked, trying to get her attention. But Jane didn't respond immediately. She just kept staring out into the darkness, her face pale. "Yeah," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw it." They both fell silent. The car continued to roll down the road, each mile stretching on longer than the last. Every curve, every bend, felt like they were driving further away from reality, as if the road itself were swallowing them whole. The dead-end sign loomed in the distance, its unsettling message echoing in their minds. Eric's fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel as they continued forward. He didn't know why, but it felt as though the road was leading them somewhere they didn't want to go. The headlights flickered again, but this time, the brief loss of light felt more sinister. It wasn't a mere malfunction. It felt deliberate, as though the darkness itself was trying to smother them. Jane finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "Maybe we should turn around." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their implications. But as Eric turned to look at her, he knew it was too late. They couldn't just turn around now. The road had already taken hold of them. He glanced in the rearview mirror once more, his eyes scanning the darkness behind them. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something, just a flicker of light, barely visible. He squinted, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He didn't say anything, not wanting to worry Jane further, but deep down, the feeling of being watched was growing stronger. There was no way he could shake the sense that something was following them. The desert road was silent now, almost unnaturally so. The engine hummed steadily, but everything else seemed to hold its breath. The only sound that broke the stillness was the occasional soft murmur from the radio, but it was too quiet, too empty. It was as if even the desert itself had gone silent, holding its secrets just beyond the horizon, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. And then, as if in response to the tension mounting between them, the headlights flickered once more, and this time, the brief flicker of darkness was accompanied by a strange, high-pitched whine. It wasn't coming from the car. It was something else. A voice, a sound too far away place. It made Eric's skin crawl. But Way looked over at Jane. She was still staring out the window, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Eric's pulse quickened. Whatever was happening, they were too far into the night, too deep into the desert to turn back now. The road had already begun to change them, slowly, imperceptibly. There was no turning around. There was only the road ahead, and whatever waited for them in the dark. The desert had already begun its pull, and there was no escaping it. Not now, not ever. The dashcam footage surfaced just days after Eric and Jane were reported missing, and it was nothing short of unsettling. At first, the investigators had hoped it would provide the breakthrough they so desperately needed, a glimpse into the final moments of the couple's journey, some sort of clue that could lead them to their whereabouts. Instead, what they found only raised more questions, furthering the mystery in ways they hadn't anticipated. The footage was grainy, almost too grainy to make out any significant details at first. It was the sort of footage you would expect from a budget dashcam, shaky and imperfect. Yet, there was something about it, something about the way it felt wrong from the very beginning. The timestamp on the footage seemed slightly off, and at first, it was dismissed as a simple error. But as investigators dug deeper, it became apparent that the time discrepancy wasn't just a minor glitch. The dashcam had been recording moments before it should have, adding to the growing sense that something unnatural was at play. The footage had been found in the vehicle of a different car entirely, one that had somehow been tied to the couple's disappearance. But what did that mean? The images on the screen played out like a haunting memory. The car, unmistakably a black sedan, was shown cruising down the same stretch of road Eric and Jane had been driving on. The headlights illuminated the cracked pavement ahead, casting long shadows that stretched like ghostly fingers into the night. For a moment, everything seemed normal, unremarkable even. But then came the first strange detail. When the car approached the camera's lens, the timestamp on the footage read 10:03 p.m. Eric and Jane had been reported missing around 9:50 p.m. So how could this footage have been recorded after they were supposed to have vanished? At first, investigators assumed that the timestamp was just a glitch, something easily explained away by the low quality of the footage. But as they began to scrutinize the video frame by frame, a sense of unease crept in. The car in the footage didn't seem to be moving at the speed Eric and Jane's vehicle should have been traveling. It was moving slower, almost as though it was caught in some sort of disjointed time lapse. The car seemed to drift, as if the engine had gone into a slower gear, or perhaps had it been forced to move more deliberately? Something wasn't right. Something was off. The sense of distortion was palpable, like the footage was trying to tell them something they weren't yet ready to understand. But what was it trying to show them? The closer they looked at the details, the more questions arose. The shadows in the footage, which once appeared to be random, began to take on a distinct quality. For an instant, they could almost see something or someone moving in the background, a figure, perhaps, just beyond the reach of the headlights, standing motionless in the distance. The figure wasn't entirely clear, but the impression was there, a dark shape against a dim desert landscape, a presence that shouldn't have been there. The camera had captured a fleeting glimpse, but it was enough to send a cold shiver down the spines of the investigators. They immediately played the footage again, but when they paused it, zooming in on the figure, the outline seemed to disappear, leaving only an empty stretch of road behind. There was nothing there, nothing but the darkness, the haunting emptiness of the desert. Had it been a trick of the light, a passing car, a mirage in the night, or was it something more? The footage continued, looping through the darkened road, until it reached a crucial moment. The car in the dashcam video suddenly slowed, as if the driver had taken a cautious turn, navigating around something unseen. The headlights flickered for a split second, casting long, jagged shadows against the desert floor. The car came to a near stop, the engine sputtering briefly, as if something was wrong with it. Then, as quickly as it had happened, the car sped up again, continuing down the road. But by then, the moment was gone. That was when the investigators realized the truth. They were looking at something that wasn't their car at all. It was a jarring revelation. The car on the footage, while similar in make and model to Eric and Jane's, wasn't actually theirs. The make, year, and even the model had slight discrepancies when checked against the vehicle they had been driving. It was enough to make the investigators' blood run cold. The dash cam footage didn't belong to Eric and Jane at all. It belonged to someone else. Someone else who had driven down that exact stretch of road at the exact same time. But who and why? The car wasn't just a stand-in for theirs. It was part of a larger mystery that only deepened with each passing day. The authorities now found themselves wondering if someone had planted the footage, or the couple had been misled in some way. Had they been followed, perhaps? Or had the car been waiting for them, hiding in the shadows of the desert until the right moment? There were too many unknowns, too many possible explanations, none of which seemed to offer any clarity. A sense of dread settled over the investigation. The realization that they were looking at a piece of evidence that only muddied the waters. This wasn't just a case of a couple vanishing. It was a story of a much more complicated, much darker narrative that no one had anticipated. As the footage continued to play, it became apparent that the car wasn't merely driving down a desolate stretch of road. It was being followed, its every move mirrored by the dashcam in front of it. The figure, the shadowy figure seen earlier, appeared once more, this time lingering in the distance, almost as though it had been waiting for the car to stop. It was standing motionless on the side of the road, its form barely visible in the flickering light. The investigators watched with bated breath as the car continued its slow journey, drawing closer to the spot where the figure stood. They paused the footage again. This time, the figure seemed to shift slightly, as though it had moved, just enough to appear more clearly in the headlights. There was no mistaking it now. It was a person, or at least something resembling a person, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. For a few seconds, the car seemed to hesitate, as though the driver was contemplating whether to stop or keep going. The headlights flickered again, casting an eerie glow over the road. The figure remained still, watching them. The sense of dread heightened. This wasn't just an ordinary roadside encounter. This was something else entirely. What was the person waiting for? Why didn't they move when the car passed by? The footage, now far too strange to ignore, continued its loop. The car drove on, seemingly unaffected by what had just happened. But the investigators couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something vital. The dashcam had captured more than just a fleeting glimpse of the road. It had shown them a moment in time, a moment that would be impossible to explain away. They couldn't just brush it off as coincidence anymore. The figure, now clearly visible in the footage, seemed to stand still long after the car had passed. It was as though the figure had no intention of leaving, as if it were waiting for something or someone to arrive. But who? The investigators found themselves in a whirlwind of questions. Why had this dashcam footage surfaced in the first place? What had happened to the real car that was supposedly driving down this road? The more they analyzed the footage, the more unsettling the questions became. But the most terrifying realization of all came when they ran the footage through a specialized program that analyzed the car's movements. The program was able to detect minor irregularities that the human eye might miss. And that's when they noticed it. A brief moment, a subtle blip in time that showed the car's headlights shifting in ways they shouldn't have, like the car was disappearing and reappearing in tiny fragments. The flickers seemed random at first, but when lined up, they formed an eerie pattern, almost as if the car was phasing in and out of existence. It wasn't just a footage that was odd, it was everything surrounding it. The timing, the inconsistencies, the faintest whispers of something being caught in the process of unraveling. It was as if the truth itself was trying to slip away, unwilling to be captured. And in the end, that was perhaps the most chilling part of it all. The footage didn't just belong to Eric and Jane. It belonged to someone else entirely. Someone who had been part of this mysterious event all along, but whose identity would remain forever obscured in the fog of the desert night. The desert, vast and unforgiving, had given up little in the search for Eric and Jane. Their car, which had been their last known possession, was found abandoned by the side of the road, just a few miles from the stretch of highway where the dashcam footage had been recorded. At first glance, there was nothing particularly unusual about it. No signs of a struggle, no broken windows, no signs of violence. The car sat there in the same way one might expect it to, untouched, waiting. The keys were still in the ignition, the engine still warm to the touch, as though the couple had just stepped out for a moment. But it was what wasn't in the car, what had disappeared with the couple, that became the center of the mystery. Eric's wallet was still inside the vehicle, tucked neatly in the glove compartment, while Jane's purse was left on the passenger seat. Their personal items, books, papers, an old map of the desert, remained untouched, as if the couple had no intention of leaving. Yet, the strangest thing of all was that Jane's phone was nowhere to be found. Eric's phone, also missing, wasn't there either. In fact, aside from their belongings, the car was strangely empty of any traces of life. No one had seen them leave, and there were no signs of their having wandered off, as though the couple had simply vanished into thin air. The car was in perfect condition, as if it had been abandoned out of convenience rather than necessity. The tires were intact, the windows rolled up, the doors locked. The only thing out of place was a faint layer of dust on the roof of the car, dust that appeared as if it had been there for hours, maybe even days. It was an unsettling sight, a seemingly ordinary car left in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by the barren desert landscape. There was no indication that Eric or Jane had been in any distress before they had left the car. No skid marks on the road. No indication that the car had been involved in any kind of accident or stopped abruptly. It was as though they had simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but their car and the fading echoes of their last moments. Local authorities were first to arrive at the scene, followed closely by a team of investigators. They methodically went to the car, hoping to uncover some clue, anything that could explain what had happened, but there was little to go on. They checked the odometer for any signs that the car had been driven far beyond where it was found, but it appeared to be right in line with where the couple should have been at that time. There were no signs of forceful entry, and there were no obvious traces of blood or physical evidence that could have suggested a violent encounter. The car was perfectly ordinary, yet something about it felt utterly out of place. The investigators scoured the immediate area around the car. The road itself was eerily quiet. The only sounds a soft rustle of the wind brushing against the dry sand and the occasional distant cry of a coyote. There were no footprints in the sand leading away from the car, no signs that anyone had been there recently, let alone two people who had supposedly disappeared just hours earlier. The team combed through the sparse desert vegetation around them, but found nothing of any significance. No items belonging to the couple, no discarded clothes, no personal effects that could point them in the right direction. The more they searched, the less they found. And the less they found, the more unnerving the whole situation became. It was as if the couple had just evaporated, leaving behind only their car and the odd, unsettling emptiness of the desert. The absence of any struggle, the lack of physical evidence. These things did not fit with the narrative of a missing persons case. There was no break-in, no confrontation, no obvious force at work. It was as though Eric and Jane had simply disappeared, as if they had walked into the desert and never returned. But why? Why would they leave the car behind? Why would they leave their phones, their wallets, their entire lives behind? The lack of any signs of forced entry or a struggle only deepened the mystery. Were they taken by force, or did they willingly leave the car? The idea that the couple had abandoned their vehicle voluntarily seemed unlikely, yet the absence of anything that could suggest otherwise made it hard to completely dismiss. Maybe they had been followed, perhaps by someone with knowledge of the road or the area. But again, there were no signs that anyone else had been nearby. It was as if the road itself had absorbed them into its vast, empty stretch, never to be seen again. One of the first things investigators looked into was the car's GPS system. After all, the technology that would have helped them navigate the remote area was right there, built into the car. But when they checked the GPS logs, they were stunned to find that the device had malfunctioned, displaying only a series of blank, erratic coordinates. There was no trace of where the car had gone. The GPS, once a reliable tool, had gone silent, just like the couple. This raised even more questions. Had the car been tampered with, or was there some external force at play? What could have caused the GPS system to fail in such a strange manner? Was this a coincidence, or had someone intentionally disabled it to leave the couple stranded in the desert, with no means of escape? The more they learned, the more it seemed as though the car was part of an elaborate puzzle, with pieces scattered across the desert like hidden fragments of story they weren't yet ready to understand. What had happened to Eric and Jane? Were they still out there, wandering the desert? Or had they been taken by someone, or something, no one could explain? Every new discovery seemed to generate more questions, each more unsettling than the last. The local authorities worked tirelessly to canvass the area, reaching out to nearby residents, truck drivers, and anyone who may have been traveling on the road that night. They spoke to a few truckers who had passed through the area during the evening, but their stories offered little in terms of hard evidence. Some claimed to have seen headlights in the distance, but nothing more than that. One trucker said he heard something strange on his radio, a series of odd, almost unintelligible sounds, like voices faintly speaking, but distorted and far away. But that was all. Just another fragment in the growing web of mystery. Despite the absence of any immediate answers, the authorities were certain of one thing. The disappearance of Eric and Jane was not a simple case of them getting lost or leaving their car behind voluntarily. No, this was something much darker, something that no one could yet explain. And yet, the evidence seemed to be evaporating with every passing hour. As the investigation into the abandoned car continued, a sense of growing unease settled over the team. It was as if the desert itself was hiding something it didn't want to reveal. The more they searched, the more they realized how little they truly knew about the land they were working to uncover. This desert, with its relentless winds and unrelenting vastness, had swallowed up the couple whole, leaving nothing behind but a cold trail of dust. There was a sense of isolation in the search that could not be ignored. This wasn't just a missing persons case. It was something deeper, something more profound. Eric and Jane had vanished in a place where the land stretched out endlessly, where time felt like it moved in strange ways, and where every decision seemed to carry the weight of something more ominous. The car had been found, but its presence only deepened the mystery. The more they dug, the further they felt they were getting from the truth. The deeper they ventured into the desert, the more they realized that the land had claimed these two people, and now it was keeping its secrets. The couple had left behind everything except the remnants of their car, an ordinary car in an extraordinary place. And the questions remained unanswered, haunting, forever suspended in the quiet desert night. Days passed, and the quiet search for Eric and Jane grew quieter still. The investigation was stalling, and as each hour passed, the uncertainty seemed to deepen, spreading a chilling sense of despair among the search teams. The desert, vast and indifferent, had swallowed the couple without a trace. There were no more leads to follow, no more evidence to examine. What remained was only the eerie silence of the land and the unsettling absence of answers. It felt as though they had been drawn into a story much larger than they had anticipated, a story written by forces they could neither see nor understand. The case had begun to wear on the investigators. They had scoured the area, interviewed locals, and even reviewed the Dashcam footage, but nothing had provided any clarity. The couple's car had been found, as if it had been placed there for them to find, like a clue left behind on purpose. But what were they supposed to make of it? Why had Eric and Jane's car been left in such an isolated location, untouched and unscathed, when the two of them had vanished into thin air? Everything about it felt like a setup, a strange play unfolding with invisible characters, and a plot that only grew more elusive the harder they tried to grasp it. The local community, once hopeful and engaged in the search efforts, began to lose faith. What could they do when the desert refused to give up its secrets? There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that Eric and Jane had been in any danger before they had left the car. It was as though they had simply chosen to disappear. But why would they do that? They had no history of running away or abandoning their lives. Eric and Jane were ordinary people with ordinary dreams, and they had been on a quiet weekend getaway when everything changed. The suddenness of it all left people baffled and eventually disillusioned. But it was the strange clues that kept the case alive, even if they didn't lead to anything concrete. The dashcam footage, the mysterious figure in the distance, the inconsistent timestamp. It all pointed to something that didn't make sense. The GPS malfunction, the faulty radio signals, the inexplicable way the car had been left behind. There was a thread of something darker running through the case, something that had yet to be revealed. It was as though the mystery itself was playing with them, teasing them with fragments, knowing they were powerless to put the pieces together. The more they dug, the more strange coincidences began to surface. Unlikely connections between Eric and Jane's disappearance and similar incidents in other parts of the country seemed to emerge. Disappearances that had gone unresolved, vanishing couples, cars abandoned on remote roads, strange signals. The patterns were too similar to ignore. Investigators couldn't shake the thought that there was something larger at play, something that had been happening long before Eric and Jane's disappearance, and something that was still happening now. As the days turned into weeks, a new theory began to emerge. The possibility that the couple's disappearance was part of a much larger web of unexplained events, linked by something invisible, something no one had considered before. At first, it seemed impossible, even ludicrous. How could Eric and Jane be tied to something so vast, so otherworldly? But as more and more pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place, the theory gained traction. Perhaps they hadn't just vanished. Perhaps they had been drawn into something that was beyond their control. One of the investigators, a man named Lieutenant Harris, had spent years working on unsolved cases, mysterious disappearances, long-forgotten deaths. He had seen things that didn't make sense, cases that had never been explained, cases that still haunted him to this day. But something about Eric and Jane's disappearance was different. It felt as though there was a deliberate hand guiding events, something pulling them into a story they weren't meant to understand. Harris couldn't shake the feeling that there was something at play here, something far bigger than the simple search for a missing couple. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this was not just about a couple vanishing into the desert. This was about something much more complex, a story unfolding in the shadows. Harris began to look back at other similar cases, incidents that seemed random at first but had eerie similarities. One case, from several years earlier, involved a young couple who had gone missing in a remote stretch of highway near the coast. Their car was found abandoned, exactly as Eric and Jane's had been, with no sign of struggle, no trace of the couple themselves. The only clue was a set of strange radio frequencies that had been recorded on the couple's car stereo in the final moments before their disappearance. The signal had been erratic, almost as though it was deliberately distorted, as though someone or something had been trying to communicate with them. The more Harris dug, the more parallels he found. Another case, from a town several hundred miles away, involved a single man who had disappeared while driving down a lonely road. His car was found untouched, but the radio had been left on, playing a strange, distorted broadcast. In each case, the people had vanished, leaving only vague clues behind. And the radio signals, they always seemed to be there, haunting the periphery of the mystery, like an invisible thread connecting these disappearances together. The pieces began to fit together in ways that made Harris's stomach tighten. He started to wonder if they were dealing with something that was beyond the realm of human understanding, something that couldn't be explained away by simple logic or reason. The radio signals, the glitches in the dashcam footage, the strange figure seen on the side of the road. Was this all part of a larger, orchestrated plan? Had these people been drawn into something much bigger than themselves, something they had no control over? The more Harris researched, the more isolated and uneasy he felt. It was as though the world he had once known, the world of evidence, of facts, of tangible truths, was slipping away. There was nothing concrete, nothing real. Only the eerie sense that they were being led down a path they couldn't see, a path that curved and twisted, evading their understanding at every turn. Meanwhile, the investigation continued to stagnate. The search teams had grown weary. Volunteers, once hopeful, began to dwindle. They had scoured the area, combed through the desert sands, but had found nothing. The authorities had released statements, updates, and warnings, but nothing ever seemed to come of it. Every new lead fizzled out. Every new clue was just another dead end. The community's interest waned as the days wore on. People moved on with their lives. Life, as it often does, resumed its rhythm, leaving the mystery of Eric and Jane's disappearance as little more than a fading headline in the local newspaper. But Lieutenant Harris couldn't let it go. The case had gotten under his skin in a way that no other case had before. He couldn't explain it, but he knew, deep down, that there was something more here. There was a force, some invisible hand, guiding the events, pulling them in a direction they couldn't yet understand. The last breakthrough came when Harris stumbled upon a cryptic message hidden in the radio frequencies. Something that didn't belong, something almost too clear to ignore. It was a pattern, an almost rhythmic pulse that seemed to repeat at regular intervals. At first, it had been dismissed as static, but when Harris played the recordings back, he heard it clearly. A voice. It was distorted, layered with static and feedback, but was there. A voice, whispering words too faint to fully understand. It was a strange thing to hear, something so out of place it almost felt like it shouldn't exist. But it was real. The message, though unintelligible, sent a chill through Harris's spine. It was clear enough that he felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. What had been happening in these cases, what had been happening to Eric and Jane, wasn't something he could explain. Theories about kidnappings, cults, and the paranormal all seemed plausible, yet equally far-fetched. No one had the answers, and even more troubling was the realization that perhaps no one ever would. They were chasing shadows, chasing a story that wasn't meant to be told. And the more they chased, the further they seemed to drift from the truth. The case had become a haunting riddle, one with no solution in sight. And as the final weeks of investigation bled into months, Harris began to fear that the answers would never come. The desert had claimed its prize, and it wasn't about to give it back. The days blurred together as the search for Eric and Jane entered its third month. The authorities had officially declared them missing, but the case had grown cold, with little hope remaining. The town that had once rallied behind their disappearance now seemed to be slowly pulling away, as though the tragedy were slipping into the past, becoming just another unsolved mystery, an unsettling story that no one could wrap their mind around. In the absence of answers, the question that haunted everyone was, what happened to them? Where had they gone? And why did the desert seem to hold on to its secrets so tightly, refusing to release even the faintest hint of the truth? But Lieutenant Harris, despite the lack of tangible evidence and the diminishing hope of the search teams, couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing something significant. It was a strange intuition that had driven him throughout his career, a kind of gut feeling that had helped him crack cases others had dismissed. Yet, the deeper he dug into the disappearance of Eric and Jane, the more he felt as though they were standing on the edge of something profound, something beyond the limits of their understanding. The case had shifted from a typical missing persons investigation to something far more unnerving. Every clue, every piece of evidence, felt like it was only leading them further away from the truth, pushing them into a realm that couldn't be explained by conventional means. The desert, as vast and desolate as it was, had become a riddle, its silence hiding something ominous, its endless horizon a boundary they could never cross. Harris couldn't stop thinking about the dashcam footage, the eerie moments where the car had been recorded, its headlights flickering, the figure seen in the distance, and the unsettling feeling of distortion that seemed to seep through the frames. Every time he reviewed the footage, it left him with more questions than answers. Who was the figure in the background? Why had the timestamp been off? And what did it mean that the footage didn't come from Eric and Jane's car, but from another vehicle entirely? The deeper Harris dug, the more confused he became. There was a sense of deliberate manipulation within the footage, a sense that it had been crafted to lead them down a particular path. But to what end? At the same time, the radio frequencies continued to nag at him. Every night, as he sat alone in his office, he would replay the strange signal that had been recorded in Eric and Jane's car, the distorted voice that whispered across the airwaves, barely audible but undeniably present. What was the source of the voice? Why had it appeared just before the couple's disappearance? Harris was certain it wasn't a coincidence. There was something at work here, something that tied the disappearances together, something that he couldn't yet grasp. As the investigation slowed, a new theory began to form in his mind, a theory that was both disorienting and frightening. The strange figure in the dashcam footage, the mysterious radio frequencies, the glitches in the GPS system, all of it pointed to the possibility that Eric and Jane hadn't simply gotten lost. They hadn't just wandered off into the desert. No, Harris began to suspect something far more complex. They had been taken not by a person but by something else, something larger, something beyond the understanding of human experience. He knew how irrational that sounded. The logical part of his brain rejected the notion, but the deeper, instinctual part of him couldn't ignore the evidence. The idea that Eric and Jane had vanished, not just into the desert, but into something that transcended the physical world, was growing stronger in his mind. What if they had encountered something supernatural, something otherworldly, that was beyond the reach of normal investigation? The thought terrified him, but it made too much sense. Every bit of evidence seemed to push him toward that conclusion, toward the belief that the desert wasn't just a place of natural beauty and harshness, but a place where the boundaries between the real and the unreal were thinner than anyone had realized. The more Harris thought about it, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit together in strange ways. There had been reports of strange occurrences in the desert long before Eric and Jane had disappeared. People had spoken of strange lights in the sky, of strange noises echoing across the dunes at night, of figures seen standing at the edge of the road, figures that vanished as quickly as they appeared. These reports were often dismissed as mirages, as a product of overactive imaginations. But what if they weren't? What if these were not hallucinations, but something real, something that had been overlooked or ignored for years? What if the desert was hiding a secret that had taken Eric and Jane, and that was still out there, waiting for someone else? Harris couldn't help but think of the reports of other disappearances in the area. Unsolved cases that seemed to have no rhyme or reason. People who had vanished without a trace, their cars left behind, just like Eric and Jane's. And in each case, there had been whispers of strange phenomena, of strange lights in the sky, of unexplained sounds that seemed to come from nowhere, of figures seen on the horizon, watching, waiting. It was as though the desert itself was a living entity, capable of drawing people in, swallowing them whole, and leaving behind nothing but confusion and fear. As Harris delved deeper into these old cases, he began to realize that there was a pattern, a connection between them all. Each case, though seemingly unrelated, had involved people who had been traveling alone or in pairs, and each of them had experienced something out of the ordinary, just before their disappearance. It was as though the desert had chosen them, and once it had, there was no escape. The more Harris researched, the more it became clear that these disappearances were not random. They were part of something larger, something that had been going on for years. And what was worse, he realized, was that the desert seemed to be actively hiding the truth. It was as if the land itself had conspired to cover up what was happening, to keep the world from seeing what lay beyond its horizon. The desert, with its endless sands and haunting beauty, had become a place where the rules of reality no longer applied, where people were drawn into the unknown and lost forever. The final breakthrough came when Harris discovered an old journal in a local library, an account from a man who had lived in the area years ago. The man had written about strange occurrences in the desert, of people who had gone missing, of sightings of lights in the sky, and of figures that move in the distance, never fully seen but always present. The journal contained drawings, sketches of strange symbols, of figures that resembled human forms, but were distorted, their features hidden in shadow. The man had written that he believed the desert was a place of power, a place where the boundary between the physical world and the unknown was thin, a place where things could slip through, things that shouldn't exist. Reading the journal sent a chill down Harris's spine. The man had spoken of a veil, a thin, fragile barrier between the world of the living and something else, something beyond human understanding. According to the journal, the veil was not always visible, but was always there, waiting to be crossed. The man had written that he believed the disappearances were the result of people inadvertently crossing that veil, stepping into a world that was not meant for them. The veil, the man wrote, could be found in the desert, in the places where horizons stretched out endlessly, where the skies seemed to meet the earth in an eternal embrace. For Harris, the journal was the missing piece. It was a final puzzle piece that tied everything together. It was as though the story of Eric and Jane's disappearance had been written in the desert long before they had ever set foot there, and now it was playing out once again, a tragic repeat of what had happened before. Harris couldn't help but wonder, had Eric and Jane stumbled upon the veil? Had they walked unknowingly into a place where the laws of reality no longer held sway? The idea seemed preposterous, but with each new piece of information, it became harder to deny. The desert, with its vast emptiness, had taken them, and now it was holding on to them, keeping them hidden from the world. The haunting question remained. If the desert had taken Eric and Jane, could they ever return? And if they did, would they still be the same people who had disappeared? Or would they be something else? Something changed by the land that had swallowed them whole? Harris had no answers, only more questions. But one thing was certain. The case was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning, and the desert, silent, empty, and vast, still held its secrets. The search for Eric and Jane, which had once been driven by hope and determination, was now a pursuit defined by a creeping sense of dread. Weeks had bled into months, and the faces of those still involved in the search had grown tired. Their eyes betrayed exhaustion, and the optimism that had once fueled their efforts had slowly been replaced by something else, a quiet resignation. The desert, with its endless expanse and harsh beauty, had become an impenetrable wall. No answers, no new leads, no discoveries, only silence. The couple had disappeared, and it was as though they had never existed. Every attempt to break through the veil of uncertainty had led to another dead end, another riddle that refused to be solved. Yet, for Lieutenant Harris, the puzzle was still not complete. There were gaps, unseen connections that he couldn't ignore, and a mounting pressure in his chest that told him the key to unraveling this mystery was just out of reach. He found himself haunted by the sense that the desert held more than just the absence of Eric and Jane. It seemed to hold the essence of their disappearance, a kind of intangible truth that had been veiled, shrouded in layers that no one had yet penetrated. Every night, he replayed the dashcam footage, over and over again, watching the slow, eerie movement of the car down the stretch of highway, searching for something he had missed. It was always the same, grainy, indistinct, but every time he felt a shiver run through him, as if the footage was trying to communicate something he couldn't fully grasp. The investigators had exhausted every possibility. Theories had come and gone, each one more fantastical than the last, yet none had provided any concrete answers. The idea of a natural disaster or a random act of violence had been dismissed early on. Eric and Jane weren't the types to get involved in anything dangerous. They were a simple couple on a quiet road trip, a trip that had turned into something far darker than anyone could have anticipated. The more Harris thought about it, the more one theory began to feel strangely plausible. Maybe this wasn't about the couple at all. Maybe their disappearance was only part of a much larger, more insidious story. The radio signals, which had initially seemed like mere background noise, now began to feel like a deliberate, hidden language. They were too precise, too insistent to be ignored. Harris felt that there was a message buried within the static, a message that could only be understood if he could figure out what was behind it all. He had heard the whispers before, faint and distorted, but now, as he listened again, something began to surface. The voice, always just out of reach, seemed to be trying to say something specific, something more than just the usual static hum of the desert. Every attempt to clear the signal made the voice louder, but also more fragmented, until one day, as Harris sat alone in his office, the voice became clear enough to understand. It wasn't a coherent sentence, not at first, but there were fragments of words, choppy, jumbled syllables that pierced through the noise. They didn't make sense, but they were deliberate. There was no mistaking it now. The voice was speaking in patterns, repeating phrases that felt like they'd been recorded, artificial, mechanical. Each time he heard it, it felt closer, more urgent, more like a message that couldn't be ignored. But what was it saying? Harris couldn't explain why, but the voice seemed to take on a deeper significance, like an invitation or summons. His instincts, sharpened by years of dealing with the mysterious and the unexplained, told him that the voice was not random. It had purpose. It had meaning. But the truth behind it was still elusive, hiding just beneath the surface, like the desert itself, vast, unknowable, and deceptively empty. The recordings had been collected from various sources, various cars, various frequencies, yet there was something strange about them. The voices weren't coming from one place. They weren't originating from any one person or entity. They were coming from everywhere, from all around the desert, it seemed. Harris found himself listening to hours of radio static and transmissions, trying to decipher what he could, all the while feeling the weight of something watching him. It wasn't paranoia. He was certain of it. The desert wasn't just a backdrop for the disappearance. It was a participant, a silent accomplice, playing its part in the puzzle that was slowly but inevitably being revealed to him. One night, as the world outside his office remained still, Harris sat back in his chair and listened. He had been listening for weeks, but tonight something was different. The voice, or what he had come to understand as a voice, was no longer distorted. It was clearer, sharper. He could make out a word here and there, and then, in a moment of clarity, he understood the message. It was one word, repeated over and over again, crossing. At first, the meaning of the word didn't hit him. It was just another fragment of the puzzle, another piece of the puzzle that hadn't quite clicked into place. But then it did. The word crossing wasn't a simple message. It was a direction. It was an instruction. Harris sat there, frozen in disbelief. The word echoed in his mind as the full weight of its meaning settled in. He had been so focused on the wrong things. The dashcam footage, the strange figure in the distance. It wasn't about them. It was about something much older, something more fundamental. Crossing wasn't a word meant for Eric and Jane. It was meant for him. The realization hit him like a wave. The disappearances weren't random. They weren't the result of some isolated act of violence or even a strange encounter. Eric and Jane had crossed the line. They had wandered into something that no one was meant to understand, let alone experience. They had crossed into something the desert kept hidden from the world. And now, somehow, that crossing was being extended to him. It was not just the couple who had vanished into the desert. The desert had been drawing people in for years, and now it had its sights set on Harris. The connections became clearer as he pieced it all together. The desert wasn't just a vast, empty space. It was a liminal place, a threshold. It had been the setting for numerous disappearances, for countless instances of people walking off the road, getting lost, never to be seen again. But what if they weren't lost? What if they had crossed into another realm, one that lay hidden beneath the surface, just out of sight, just beyond reach? Harris felt his mind racing. The voice, the signals, the disappearances, everything was connected. He had spent so much time focusing on the physical, on what he could see, what he could touch, that he had overlooked the truth. The desert was not just a place of isolation. It was a place of transition, a place of thresholds, of crossing points. People didn't just disappear. They crossed. And once they crossed, they were never the same. But there was something more. Harris couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something greater, something he could barely begin to understand. The desert wasn't just a vast emptiness. It was alive in its own way. It was a place where the rules of time, space, and reality didn't hold. Eric and Jane had disappeared, yes, but they hadn't been taken. They had crossed into something else, something beyond this world. And as for the voice, it wasn't just a random signal. It was a guide, a whisper from the other side, trying to communicate with him, to show him the way. Harris sat back in his chair, his thoughts whirling. The word, crossing, echoed in his mind, reverberating through the empty office, through his very soul. The desert had called him in, and now it was calling him, too. It wasn't just about finding answers anymore. It was about something much larger, something that transcended human understanding. The desert, it seemed, wasn't just a place of loss. It was a place of transformation, and if Harris wanted to uncover the truth, he would have to cross over. The notion of crossing weighed heavily on Lieutenant Harris's mind. Each time he thought about it, the words seemed to reverberate deeper, filling the empty spaces between his thoughts, occupying every quiet moment with a sense of urgency he couldn't ignore. It was no longer just a theory or a stray piece of the puzzle. It felt like a prophecy, something that was meant to happen, a challenge being placed before him by forces beyond his comprehension. The desert, with all its vastness, with all its emptiness, had become more than just a physical space to be searched. It had transformed into a living entity, something that was silently watching him, waiting for him to understand what it wanted. Harris had always prided himself on being a man of reason. He had solved countless cases throughout his career, using logic and methodical investigation to uncover the truth. But this case, Eric and Jane's disappearance, had defied every logical explanation. It had led him to a place where facts no longer mattered, where the physical world seemed to blur with the unknown. The more he uncovered, the more it seemed that the desert wasn't simply a setting for a crime. It was a crime itself, a silent, unyielding force that was manipulating events in ways no one could explain. Every clue that had been uncovered, every piece of evidence that had been pieced together, had pointed towards something larger than a mere disappearance. Eric and Jane hadn't just wandered off or gotten lost. They hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. No, something had drawn them in, something that lay hidden beneath the surface of the desert, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And now, it seemed that the same thing was happening to Harris. He could feel it. The pull, the whisper, the invisible force that seemed to be guiding him toward a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to understand. There were nights when he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the puzzle. He could almost hear the desert calling to him, beckoning him with the same hypnotic allure that had drawn Eric and Jane into its depths. The voice on the radio, the strange, distorted signals, the inexplicable glitches in the footage, all of it seemed to be pointing toward one undeniable truth. The desert wasn't just a place. It was a passage, a threshold, and once you crossed it, there was no going back. The question was no longer whether Eric and Jane were still alive, but whether they had ever truly existed in the same way again after crossing into the desert's grasp. The word crossing continued to echo in his mind like a riddle that refused to be solved. What did it mean? Was it a warning? A command? A calling? The desert was not a place of refuge. It was not a place where you want to find peace or answers. It was a place where things were lost, never to be found again. But what if, by crossing that threshold, you entered something else? Something that didn't obey the rules of the world Harris knew? Could Eric and Jane have become something more, something different, by walking into that vast emptiness? And if they had, what would that mean for him? Standing on the edge of the same unknown, looking out at the desert that swallowed him whole? As the days stretched on, Harris found himself pulling away from his colleagues. He couldn't share his thoughts with them, couldn't explain the way his mind was racing, or the visions that seemed to haunt him. The more he learned, the more isolated he felt. No one else seemed to see the connections the way he did, or if they did, they weren't willing to admit it. His obsession with the desert's power grew, until it felt like a heavy weight in his chest. He needed to understand what had happened to Eric and Jane, and why the desert was keeping them hidden. More importantly, he needed to understand why it had chosen him to find the truth. It was in one of these moments of solitary reflection, as he sat alone in his office once again, listening to the radio recordings, that the answer, if you could call it that, finally came to him. The signals, the faint whispers, had been there all along. They weren't just background noise. They were a pattern, a deliberate message woven into the fabric of the desert itself. Harris hadn't understood it at first because he had been looking for the wrong thing. He had been trying to decode the signals, to translate them into something tangible, something rational. But the truth wasn't hidden in the words themselves. It was hidden in the spaces between the words, the pauses, the gaps, the silence. In the absence, there was meaning. In the nothingness, there was everything. He replayed the recordings over and over, letting the fragmented voice wash over him. The words were still distorted, but now they felt different. Now, there was an understanding, an unspoken connection. It was like hearing a language you didn't know, but somehow you could feel the meaning in your bones. The voice wasn't just a message. It was a guide. It was calling to him, urging him to understand, to follow it. And the word it kept repeating, crossing, wasn't just a word at all. It was a state of being. It was a condition. To cross wasn't to simply move from one place to another. It was to transform, to transcend, to become something more. Harris could feel it now, the pull. It wasn't a physical sensation, but something deeper, something primal. It was as though the desert itself was drawing him in, not as a victim, but as a participant. He had been searching for truth all along, but now he realized that the truth wasn't something to be found. It was something to be experienced. The desert wasn't just a backdrop to the mystery. It was the mystery itself. The question wasn't what had happened to Eric and Jane. The question was, what had they become? With this realization, Harris's world shifted. The investigation, the search, had always been about finding answers, about piecing together the scattered fragments of a story that seemed impossible to tell. But now, the story wasn't about the past. It was about the present and the future. The crossing wasn't something that had happened to Eric and Jane alone. It was something that was happening to him now, something that was calling to him, urging him to step into the unknown.